Why do men suddenly take action after weeks of hesitation without any pressure or words from you? Picture this scenario. He's been contemplating an important decision for months. You've said nothing, demanded nothing, haven't even brought up the topic. Then one day he acts, exactly as you hoped he would. What happened? Sigmund Freud discovered over a century ago the hidden mechanisms of the human unconscious. He realized that 90% of our decisions don't arise from rational thinking, but are controlled by unconscious drives, projections, and repressed needs. These insights are more relevant today than ever before. The 5 techniques you're about to discover are based on Freud's revolutionary insights into the human psyche. They work because they communicate directly with the unconscious mind, where all important decisions are truly made. If you want to understand how to use these psychological laws to your advantage, subscribe to the channel now. The first signal already shows itself in how you can activate his unconscious mirror neurons. The first and most powerful tool lies in a mechanism Freud described as unconscious identification, the mirror effect. Your behavior becomes his internal compass without his conscious mind ever knowing it. Picture this. You're sitting together at dinner. He tells you about his stressful day. Instead of immediately offering advice or showing sympathy, you lean back slightly, breathe calmly, and consciously relax your shoulders. You say nothing about his stress. Instead, you radiate pure calmness through your body language. What happens in his unconscious? Freud's research shows that the human brain possesses mirror neurons that automatically want to imitate other people's behavior. When you radiate calmness, his nervous system unconsciously begins to adopt that calmness. He becomes more relaxed without knowing why. But the real breakthrough comes through what Freud called projection. When you consistently embody a certain emotional quality like determination, clarity, inner strength, his unconscious begins projecting these qualities onto you. In his eyes, you become the person who possesses these qualities, and people always act according to how they believe important people in their lives expect them to act. The key is that you never directly demand or expect anything. You simply embody what you wish for. If you want him to be more decisive, you become an example of decisiveness yourself, not through words, but through your entire presence. Freud recognized that the ego is above all a bodily ego. What does this mean practically? Your body constantly communicates with his unconscious. The way you walk, speak, breathe, hold your gaze, all of this continuously sends signals to his deeper layers of perception. A concrete example. You want him to make an important career decision he's been pondering for weeks. Instead of addressing the topic, you begin making clear, quick decisions in other areas of your life. You decide immediately what to wear. You choose the evening restaurant without hesitation. You make small daily decisions with new determination. His unconscious registers this pattern. It absorbs the message that making decisions is normal, natural, and right. The fear of decision-making that exists in his consciousness gets neutralized by the unconscious message of your behavior. The fascinating part is, he'll never understand why he's suddenly ready to act. He'll convince himself that he's finally found clarity, or that the right moment has come. But in reality, you've changed his unconscious decision-making pattern through the mirror effect. Have you ever noticed how people around you develop similar habits or ways of thinking after spending time with you? But this mechanism becomes even more powerful through what follows in the next step, consciously using emptiness and silence to force his unconscious into self-activity. The second secret lies in a technique Freud described as free association. When you consciously create gaps, his unconscious fills this emptiness with his deepest truths and desires and acts accordingly. Imagine this. He tells you about a problem at work. Instead of immediately responding with advice or comfort, you look at him attentively, nod slowly, and remain silent. 3, 4, 5 seconds pass. In this silence, something amazing happens. His mind automatically begins filling the gap. What happens in his unconscious? Freud discovered a fundamental law of human psychology: horror vacui, the fear of emptiness. The unconscious cannot tolerate silence and incomplete communication. It must immediately fill these gaps with meaning, even when consciousness doesn't know where this meaning comes from. In the seconds of your silence, he unconsciously projects his own solutions into the empty space. He begins thinking deeper on his own, developing new perspectives, making decisions. And this is crucial, he experiences these thoughts as his own insights, not as influenced by you. Freud called this mechanism projection of one's own desires. When you don't tell him what to do, but signal through your attentive presence that you believe in his abilities, he projects his best qualities into the situation. The gap becomes a mirror of his unused potential. A practical example: he's been hesitating for weeks about applying for a new job. Instead of asking, "When will you finally apply?" or "You should really take action," you use the gap strategy. You say, "I sometimes think about how people recognize when the right moment for big steps has come." Then you fall silent. What happens? His unconscious automatically takes over, continuing this thought. Since you haven't made a direct demand, there's no resistance. Instead, his mind begins filling the gap with his own considerations. Maybe now really is the right time. Maybe I've been waiting too long. The psychoanalytic reason: you've triggered a Zeigarnik effect through the incomplete statement. The unconscious cannot let unfinished thoughts rest. It automatically continues working on them, even when consciousness is busy with other things. This technique becomes even more effective through strategic body language. While you remain silent, you don't look expectant or impatient. Your posture says, "I trust that you carry the right answer within you." This non-verbal message reinforces his unconscious readiness to fill the gap with constructive solutions. Freud recognized, "Where I was, their ego shall be." This means, where unconscious blockages once were, new impulses for action can emerge through conscious techniques. The gap strategy creates exactly this space for transformation. Another element: use open statements instead of closed questions. Not, "Do you really want this?" but "I sometimes wonder what people really want." The open form invites his unconscious to become active instead of reacting defensively. Have you ever noticed how people suddenly express the most important truths after a longer pause in conversation? But you achieve true mastery only through the third step: how you don't overcome his natural defense mechanisms, but use them for your goals. The third breakthrough is based on Freud's revolutionary insight about defense mechanisms. Instead of fighting against his resistance, you transform it into an ally through the technique of paradoxical contradiction. Imagine this: you want him to eat healthier, but every time the topic comes up, he becomes defensive. Instead of trying to convince him, you say, "I actually find it admirable how consistent you are with your habits. Many people can't do that." Then you fall silent and observe what happens, what occurs in his unconscious. Freud described reaction formation, a defense mechanism where the unconscious automatically produces the opposite of what it perceives as a threat. However, when you seemingly praise his current behavior instead of criticizing it, his resistance cannot take hold. The unconscious must find a new way. The psychoanalytic mechanism works like this. His defense system is programmed to react against pressure and criticism. But when you acknowledge his current decisions, a cognitive contradiction arises within him. Part of him knows that current habits aren't optimal. This part can now become active because the defense mechanism wasn't activated. Freud called this ambivalence, the simultaneous presence of opposing feelings. Every person carries both the desire for change and the desire to maintain the status quo within themselves. Through the contradiction mechanism, you speak directly to the change-willing part without threatening the conservative part. Another example: he procrastinates on an important project. Instead of saying, "You must finally start," you use, "I admire how thoroughly you think about this project. Most people would just work blindly ahead." This apparent confirmation of his hesitation creates an internal contradiction. His unconscious thinks, if this is so positive, why doesn't it feel good? The breakthrough happens through what Freud called sublimation. The energy that normally flows into resistance gets redirected into constructive action. He begins acting, not because you demanded it, but because his own psychological system seeks balance. Your inner attitude is important here. You mustn't appear manipulative or sarcastic. The contradiction mechanism only works when you can authentically appreciate a facet of his behavior. Every trait has positive and negative aspects. You consciously emphasize the positive to give the negative space for transformation. The technique requires subtle precision. You don't say, "You're so disciplined at watching TV," but you have a remarkable ability to relax after stressful days. The difference: you appreciate the basic needs behind the behavior, not the problematic behavior itself. Freud recognized repression is never complete. This means the part of him that wants change is always present. Through the contradiction mechanism, you give this part space without alarming the anxious part. This technique works particularly well with people who have strong defense mechanisms. The more someone normally resists, the more powerfully the paradoxical confirmation works. Have you ever noticed how people sometimes become active precisely when you stop expecting something from them? But the fourth step leads even deeper: how you address his oldest emotional patterns without his adult consciousness knowing about it. The fourth mechanism uses Freud's groundbreaking discovery of regression, the return to earlier developmental stages under stress. When you address his infantile basic needs, he acts from much deeper motivation than his rational mind could ever produce. Picture this. He's stressed and indecisive about an important life decision. Instead of presenting logical arguments, you create an atmosphere of unconditional security. You prepare his favorite meal, dim the lights, speak with a calm, steady voice. You don't treat him like an adult who must solve problems, but like someone who first needs to arrive and feel safe. What happens psychoanalytically? Freud recognized that under pressure, all people return to earlier developmental stages. In this state of regression, it's not the complex adult anxieties that become active, but the simple, basic needs of the inner child: security, unconditional acceptance, the feeling of being protected. The key lies in the first 3 years of life. Freud discovered that during this time, every person learns whether the world is fundamentally safe or dangerous, whether other people are trustworthy or threatening, whether they themselves are lovable or rejectable. These primal convictions remain active in the unconscious for life. When you activate his early childhood security needs through your behavior, you bypass all adult defense mechanisms. His unconscious returns to a state where action was still possible before fear of wrong decisions, rejection, or failure paralyzed his system. A concrete example: he hesitates to have an important conversation with his boss. Instead of discussing strategies or encouraging courage, you activate his regression to a state of unconditional support. You say, "Whatever happens, I'm proud of you. You don't have to prove anything." And this message reaches directly to the inner child who once learned, "I'm only lovable if I'm successful." The deeper effect arises through what Freud called deferred action, the healing re-evaluation of early experiences. When you now give him the unconditional acceptance he would have needed as a child, his psychological system can heal this old wound. The blockage doesn't dissolve through rational insight, but through emotional correction. The right timing is important. The regression trap works best when he's already stressed or overwhelmed. In relaxed states, adult defense mechanisms are too strong. But when he's under pressure, the gate to the inner child opens. Your body language must correspond to that of a loving, protective presence, not controlling or teaching, but like someone who is unconditionally there. Freud described this as a holding environment, a psychological space where development becomes possible again. The regression trap requires genuine emotional maturity from your side. You mustn't exploit his temporary vulnerability, but must treat it as a healing moment. When you authentically care for his deepest needs, his unconscious responds with original capacity for action. Another aspect, use words and tone that remind him of early security experiences. Don't speak childishly, but with the calm and reliability that children need for healthy development. Have you ever noticed how differently people become when they feel truly safe and accepted? But you achieve the most elegant transformation through the fifth step. How you unconsciously become the most important reference person in his emotional system. The fifth and perhaps most powerful mechanism uses Freud's discovery of transference, how people unconsciously project earlier relationship patterns onto new persons. When you skillfully activate the role of a significant reference person from his past, he automatically acts as if your opinion were existentially important. Imagine this. In a quiet moment, he tells you about his childhood, about people who shaped him, perhaps a beloved grandmother, a respected teacher, a mentor. You don't just listen, but register the emotional qualities this person embodied for him: wisdom, unconditional love, trust in his abilities. In the following weeks, you begin embodying exactly these qualities in your interaction with him. What happens in the unconscious? Freud discovered that every person carries an internal object relation system, emotional templates of all important relationships from the past. When you activate the specific characteristics of a positive reference person from his history, his unconscious transfers the feelings from that time onto you. The psychoanalytic mechanism works through repetition compulsion, the unconscious need to reproduce earlier relationship dynamics. But instead of repeating problematic patterns, you consciously activate healing, strengthening transferences. You become the good internal mother or the wise internal father, archetypes that already exist in his unconscious. A concrete example: he once told you about his grandfather who always believed in him, even when others doubted. This person embodied unconditional trust in his potential for him. You begin adopting exactly this attitude toward him, not through big words, but through your way of looking at him, responding to his ideas, talking about his future. His unconscious recognizes the familiar pattern and automatically activates the response from that time. He becomes again the person he was in the presence of this beloved reference person, self-confident, ready to act, courageous. The transference transforms him back into his best version. Freud recognized transference creates an intermediate stage between illness and life. This means, through positive transference, blocked life energy and buried abilities can be reactivated. You become the catalyst for his unlived potential. The key lies in subtle observation. Pay attention to how his voice, posture, and presence change when he talks about people who positively influenced him. This change shows you which internal objects exist within him. You can activate these through corresponding behavior. Important: you don't copy external characteristics, but emotional qualities. If his mother loved him unconditionally, you embody unconditional acceptance. If his mentor intellectually challenged him, you challenge him in a similarly respectful way. The deepest effect arises through what Freud called corrective emotional experience. Through positive transference, not only current blockages heal, but also old wounds. You become a source of subsequent emotional development. A subtle aspect: transference works bidirectionally. While you activate his positive internal objects, he begins seeing in you the qualities those former reference persons had. You become more important, valuable, significant in his eyes. Have you ever noticed how some people suddenly become a better version of themselves in your presence? But you achieve completion of all techniques only through the sixth step: how you direct his repressed energies exactly in the direction you desire. The sixth and final mechanism uses Freud's most revolutionary discovery, sublimation, the transformation of unconscious drive energy into constructive action. When you recognize and skillfully channel his repressed impulses, he will act with a force his conscious thinking could never mobilize. Imagine this. He's frustrated in his job, but doesn't dare to quit. You recognize that behind this stagnation lies massive pent-up energy, anger about injustice, longing for recognition, suppressed creativity. Instead of talking about rational job change strategies, you channel these energies. You say, "I sense an incredible force in you that's just waiting to show itself." Some people hide their true potential their whole lives. What happens psychoanalytically? Freud discovered that all human energy ultimately stems from the libido, an original life force that can manifest in various forms. When this energy gets blocked by fears, social norms, or self-doubt, it accumulates and seeks alternative outlets. Sublimation works by consciously directing this accumulated energy in the desired direction. You don't address the superficial problem like job dissatisfaction, but the underlying force, drive for self-realization, suppressed ambitions, buried dreams. A key element, you must identify his specific repressions. Freud taught that every person has suppressed certain aspects of their personality. For him, it might be the rebellious part that was put down as a child, or the creative part that was dismissed as impractical, or the leadership aspect that was criticized as too dominant. These repressed parts contain enormous energy. When you address and appreciate them, this energy literally explodes into constructive action. He acts not from rational consideration, but from reawakened life force. A practical example. You notice he was very creative before, but has suppressed this part. You say, "It's fascinating how some people can transfer their original creativity into completely new fields. They become innovators in areas where others only see routine." This statement reactivates his repressed creative drive and sublimates it directly into professional innovation. The deeper mechanism, Freud recognized that repression never destroys energy, it only redirects it. This redirected energy often creates symptoms like dissatisfaction, restlessness, diffuse anxieties. Through conscious sublimation, you transform this symptom energy back into life force. Your role in this, you become the catalyst of sublimation. You recognize his dormant energies and create a psychological space where they can unfold again. Not through pressure or persuasion, but through recognition of his repressed greatness. A subtle aspect. Sublimation must authentically connect to his true nature. You cannot create arbitrary energies, but you can reawaken buried potential. Freud said, "Man becomes what he always was, but didn't dare to be." You achieve the highest form of sublimation when several repressed aspects are activated simultaneously. Then an energy avalanche emerges that sweeps away all previous blockages. He doesn't just act in the desired direction, but becomes a more powerful version of himself. Have you ever experienced how people suddenly act with unexpected energy and clarity after rediscovering their true nature? These 6 mechanisms together create a psychological transformation that goes deeper than any rational persuasion work. They awaken the sleeping giant in his unconscious. Freud recognized over 100 years ago that true power doesn't lie in what we consciously think, but in what our unconscious feels and desires. These 6 mechanisms work with the deepest layers of human psychology. What hidden force in your own unconscious is waiting to be awakened to transform your relationships forever? Drop a comment telling me which city you're watching from. I'm curious about our worldwide community of psychology enthusiasts.